I'm really excited to introduce Caroline from Loon Preservation Committee. She's here. She just had a job change title. She is now the volunteer and outreach biologist, which is a really great combination. She's been working for LPC since 2016. I've been so lucky to hear her talk about loons in the past, and I can promise you that tonight's going to be really a wonderful and exciting and just beautiful presentation. So Caroline, welcome.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you to the Harris Center for hosting this tonight. We're always so excited to be able to collaborate with you guys, whether it's through a presentation like this or out in the field where you're helping us put out rafts. So thank you so much for having me tonight, and those sound like some really awesome programs that you have coming up. So I'm going to start this talk off by discussing loon calls. And the reason I like to do that is because for a lot of people, the call of the loon is one of the most intriguing and interesting things about them. And what you may not know is that loons have several different types of calls that they use in different contexts and that, all have different meanings. So I'm going to play these calls for you, and then we'll take some time to talk about each one and what it means. So the first call I'll play is the wail. So the wail is one of those really quintessential loon calls, right? If you've been around a lake, you've probably heard that call. It's used primarily for long distance communication, and particularly between the members of a loon pair. So the loons don't always stick right together on the lake, right? They might go their separate ways and forage separately, or sometimes the loons will even leave their lake to go forage somewhere else. And so when it comes time for them to, come back and find their mate again, you'll hear the wail call. The wail is also frequently given during night chorusing. Night chorusing, if you've ever been around the lakes at night, you'll know that the loons are very active in terms of vocalizations. So you'll hear a lot of wailing. You'll also hear tremoloing, which I'll talk about later. And you'll particularly hear that in either, geographic areas where there are a lot of small lakes and ponds in a relatively small area, or on large lakes. So for example, Lake Winnipesaukee, which has over 20 pairs of loons, you'll hear the night chorus a lot. And so it seems to be a way for neighboring pairs of loons to check in with each other and to familiarize themselves with one another. I'll also add that there are several variations on the wail. So in terms of the number of the syllables that are in a wail and the frequencies that are produced, the pitches, and they can mean different things. So if you hear a longer wail with more syllables and more changes in frequency or pitch, that's typically a wail that is denoting a little bit of alarm. So you'll hear loons giving that sort of a wail when they're involved in territorial interactions with other loons. It's sort of a way to alert their partner to the fact that that interaction is going on. The next call is a hoot. So I'm sorry, there's a little bit of background noise in that recording, but hopefully you were able to hear the hoot clearly. That's a much softer and a shorter call. It's one that you may not have heard before unless you've been in relatively close proximity to loons. This is a call that is for short range communication, again, typically between the members of a family unit. So the adult loons will hoot back and forth to each other, and they'll hoot to their chicks. The chicks, when they're young, can't produce that vocalization. It's about at 3 months of age when they start being able to produce these more adult vocalizations. And similar to the wail, loons might give a higher pitched hoot, which is referred to as the toot, when they're in territorial interactions with other loons. And again, that just denotes a little bit of alarm. I'm going to save the yodel for last because it's a really, really cool and interesting call. And it's just one that I like to take a little more time with. So I'll skip ahead to the tremolo, which is another one of those really quintessential loon calls that you've probably heard before and are familiar with. And so the tremolo is a call that is most often associated with loons being alarmed or being stressed. So we hear this call a lot, again, if they're in a territorial interaction with an intruding loon. We'll also hear this call if predators are nearby, and particularly when eagles are flying overhead. Sometimes we'll even hear the tremolo when an airplane is flying overhead and we think that they might be mistaking that plane for an eagle. But this is a call that's also given when humans are presenting a threat to loons. So when a person in a boat, whether that's a motorboat or a kayak or a canoe, is getting too close to that loon or its nest or its chicks. And so the fourth call is the yodel. And there are a lot of really cool and interesting things about the yodel. A lot of work has been done in terms of analyzing the yodel. And the first cool thing about it is that this is one of the only ways, unless your loons are banded, that you can tell male and female loons apart. And that's because only male loons give this call. So visually, loons do not really display sexual dimorphism. They're virtually identical in terms of their plumage and their patterns. Males do tend to be somewhere between 15 and 20% larger, but not always. And even if they are larger, it can be really hard to tell when you're on the water looking at them. And so if you hear this yodel, that's one of the best ways to tell that the loon that you're looking at is a male. And so this call is a really aggressive call. It's used primarily in territory defense, and that loon is letting whatever it's perceiving as a threat, be that an intruding loon or a human in a boat or an eagle or an airplane, it's letting that other entity know that it's willing to fight and defend its territory. Another really cool thing about the yodel is that each male's yodel is unique, so they can use it to identify one another. And that can be a real advantage if you're, in a territorial interaction and you're trying to decide whether or not to escalate to a physical fight, right? So if you've fought this other loon before and you lost, you're probably going to hear that yodel and think, oh no, I'm not gonna challenge this guy. I got to get out of here. And the yodel also can communicate things about a loon's body size, about its body condition, and about its level of aggression that again can let other loons or give other loons information to help them decide whether or not they want to try to take on that loon in a fight. So it's really advantageous for loons on both ends, the territorial male and the intruder, to be giving these calls so that they can figure stuff out about the other one and decide if they do want to escalate to a physical confrontation. Okay, so now that we've talked about what loons sound like, I'd like to talk a little bit about what they look like. And I include this at the beginning of my presentations because we do have several look-alike species on our lakes here in New Hampshire, birds that have the same coloration, black and white, or that are similar in size. And so sometimes at the Loon Center, we do get reports of, a loon in distress or a dead loon that turns out to be a merganser or a goose or a cormorant. So I want to talk about some field markings that can help you tell loons apart from other bird species. So the first is this checkered pattern on the loon's back, those white squares on that background of black. Other birds on the water might be black and white or dark in color, but none of them are going to have that checkered pattern. And similarly, no other bird is going to have this black and white striped, we call it a collar or a necklace, but that's a black and white striped band that wraps around the neck. The loons also have that really, really distinct bright red eye. And then the final really useful field marking to know if you're looking at a loon is the color and the shape of the bill. So loons' bills, at least when they're adults in breeding plumage, are black, and they're really, really long and sharp. We actually refer to it as being dagger-like. And so I'm just going to advance to this slide, which shows some of those look-alike species. So again, the male merganser, which is black and white, but the white goes much further up the sides, and it has a red bill rather than the black bill that a loon has. Cormorants are similar in shape, but they're more slender, and again, they don't have a black bill. Geese are sort of similar in coloration, but they have a much longer neck than the loon does, and their bill is the same color, it's black, but it's much more blunt at the tip. And then up here we have a female merganser, which doesn't look too much like a loon, but when they're with the males, people can get them confused. And so sometimes we'll get a report of a loon with 9 or 10 chicks. And because loons only have a maximum of 2 chicks per year, we typically assume that that's actually either a merganser or maybe a goose. But getting back to our loons, so this is what they look like when they're on our lakes in the spring, the summer, and into the fall, right? This is a loon in its alternate or breeding plumage. But our loons don't look like this year round. And so if you've spent time on the lakes later into the fall, you might have started seeing loons look like this. At this point, their plumage is starting to look a little worn and shabby, and actually right around the bill is typically where they start showing signs of the molt. So you'll see loons with white feathers coming in around their bill and maybe further back on their heads. And then by the time our loons are on their wintering grounds, they look totally different. So that if you didn't know that they had this plumage change, you might think that this was a totally different bird, right? It still has that loon shape, but its plumage is much more of a drab gray. Even its bill dulls down to a gray, or in some loons, it turns like totally white. And it retains a red eye, but it really dulls down to more of a reddish brown. So they look totally, totally different. And their diet changes too. So you'll notice that the loon in this photo is eating a lobster, which they can't get on our lakes. And we often receive photos of wintering loons chowing down on lobster or crabs, or sometimes even marine worms. So a lot about what they're doing and what they look like changes during the winter. Our loons here in New Hampshire, we think primarily are spending the winter right off of our coasts in the area of the Gulf of Maine. So we have a small number of banded New Hampshire loons that have either been resighted on the ocean or in sadder circumstances turn up dead on their wintering grounds. And so the furthest north that we've recorded a banded New Hampshire loon on the ocean is around Mount Desert Island. The furthest south is around Cape May, New Jersey, but the vast majority of the band resights we get from the winter tend to be in the Gulf of Maine. So the coasts of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So the breeding season, when loons are ready to come back to their lakes, and we think that migration is at least partially triggered by changing photo periods. So as the days get longer, that's an indicator to them that they need to start coming back. They typically arrive on our lakes the day of ice out, and sometimes they'll arrive if even if their lake still has some ice on it, as long as it has a patch of open water big enough for them, sometimes they'll be back. And so because they don't have very far to fly, we think that what they're actually doing is making recon trips as they start to realize that the breeding season is coming up. They might fly over, check to see if their lake is open, and if it's not, either go back to the ocean or go back to a bigger lake nearby that is open already. And once the loons are on our lakes, they spend the first couple of weeks reestablishing their pair bond. So loons have really high rates of territory fidelity, so they tend to come back to the same territory each year, especially if they've been successful and had chicks on that territory in the past. So it's not always guaranteed that it's your same pair of loons back on your lake every year, because some loons do die over the winter and they're replaced. And sometimes these intruder loons actually show up before the territory holder and then fight that territory holder for control of the lake. And if the territory holder loses, then it's kicked out and that new loon takes its place. So it's not a guarantee that it's your same loons back each year, but it's pretty likely. And I think the numbers are something like an 80% chance that it's your same pair. And so they spend a couple of weeks reestablishing that pair bond. As far as we're aware, male and female loons do not, or at least the members of a pair do not spend the winter together. And so they have to kind of get reacquainted with each other. So they spend some time, patrolling their territory together. We sometimes get calls from people who are reporting seeing a mating dance, big flashy, splashy movements. But loons don't actually do mating dances like that. And so if you're seeing a really, big, flashy, splashy interaction between loons, chances are that's actually a fight and not, the two members of your pair. Courtship in loons includes just swimming around together, diving in sync. Sometimes they'll do what we call the bill dip, which is where they submerge just the front tip of their bill in the water while facing each other. They'll pull it back up and do that 2 or 3 times. And we think that's like a deferential behavior to one another. And you also may see them cruising around the shoreline or cruising around the islands and checking out different nest sites in preparation for nesting. So in New Hampshire, the median date of nest initiation is the first week of June. Typically 50% of our loons will be on the nest by the end of that first week of June. We do always have some early birds, and those are usually the ones that are on further south lakes that open up first. So we've had nesting as early as the first week of May. And we also have some very late birds who might not start nesting until the last week of June or the first week of July even. But in general, most of our loons are on the nest by early June, and typically they're laying 2 eggs. On some occasions, they only lay 1, and on very, very, very rare occasions, they may lay 3. But again, that's super rare, and it's even more rare for 3 chicks to hatch. So in general, it's 2 eggs. In general, they are laid 12 to 24 hours apart, although as we've learned from our loon cams in recent years, sometimes they lay their eggs 50 or, not 50, 50 is high, but 36 to 48 hours apart. And so, but in general, for most loons, it's 12 to 24 hours apart. And then they incubate those eggs for about 26 to 28 days. Important to note is that continuous incubation really doesn't start until the clutch is complete. And so sometimes we get calls from folks who are concerned because their loons have put down 1 egg and they're just sort of ignoring it. They might come back and turn it or sit on it for a couple minutes, but then they get back off. But that's totally normal because usually they don't start continuously incubating until that 2nd egg has been laid. Once they start incubating, the incubation duties are shared pretty much equally between the male and the female. We have found that early on in the incubation period, the male is doing a little bit more of the incubating on average. And the hypothesis there is that, the female has just laid these 2 giant eggs, which takes a lot of energy to produce, and it's a lot of energy to lay those eggs as well. And so she might need a little bit more time soon after doing that to forage and get her energy stores back up. But by the time we're partway through the incubation period, things have leveled out. And then actually towards the end of the incubation period, closer to hatch, the female is doing slightly more of the incubating than the male on average. So there are exceptions to this rule. Every loon pair is different, but in most cases, that's sort of the pattern that they display. And then because those eggs were laid 12 to 24 hours apart, they're also hatching 12 to 24 hours apart. And so in many cases, in virtually all cases, that results in sibling rivalry and a dominant structure between the chicks. That first hatch chick, has a day's worth of feeding on its sibling, so it's a little bit stronger. And essentially from the time that sibling hatches, that first chick lets it know who's boss and will make sure that it is fed first and that it gets its fill before its sibling is allowed to eat. And as we're watching that can seem really cruel. But it's a strategy that's developed to ensure that, on years where food supplies are low, that at least 1 chick is going to survive. So from the outside perspective, it's really tough to watch, but it's a strategy that has proven to help them in the past. I will mention that if a loon's first nest fails, and it's not uncommon for a nest to fail, about 40% of our nests in New Hampshire do fail, the loons may re-nest. And typically, especially if their nest failed earlier on in the season, they'll re-nest. As we start to get into July, it's a little bit less likely because at that point, they have to spend 28 days incubating, and then that chick has to be able to grow enough to be able to make it off the lake before the ice comes in. So we typically don't see too many nests being initiated after early to mid-July. So when these chicks hatch, they're what we call semi-precocial. So precocial in that they have all of their down, and they really only need a couple of hours to dry off on the nest before they're ready to get in the water and swim and dive. Semi in that they are totally reliant on their parents for food. So especially when the chicks are young, the parents are providing 100% of their diet. So you'll often see chicks doing what this chick is doing in those first couple weeks of its life, back riding. And back riding serves several functions. So first, it's a way of chicks to regulate their body temperature. The lakes feel really nice to us in the summer, right? But to a tiny little 100-gram loon chick, it can get cold really, really fast. And so it's an advantage for them to be able to climb up onto their parents' backs and snuggle down under their wings. It helps to keep them warm. Back riding also provides protection from underwater predators. So things like large fish or snapping turtles can and will go after a loon chick. And so being on top of the parent prevents that. And then the third reason is just, because they need to rest. So again, this is a really small chick. It doesn't have a lot of energy stores. And it can be really helpful for them to be able to hitch a ride and just, relax and get back their energy. You'll also typically see the adults diving pretty much continuously to feed these chicks. So it'll feed the chick and immediately dive again, catch something else, and that can go on for hours. And the reason that happens is because these chicks have a lot of growing to do. So I said before that they hatch at a weight of about 100 grams. And by the time they're 12 weeks old, they're weighing somewhere around 4,000 grams. So in 12 weeks, that's quite a lot of growing that they need to do. And so they really do need a continuous intake of food. Early on in the chick's development, most of the energy that comes from eating goes towards growing their legs and their feet. And that's so that they are able to quickly learn how to swim better and they're able to dive. Oh. By the time chicks are about 6 weeks old, they start looking like this. And we affectionately refer to this as the punk rock stage because you'll see these chicks going around with little down mohawks as their down is replaced by their first set of feathers. You'll also notice that this chick's bill has started to elongate and take on a little bit more of that characteristic loon bill shape. And the chick in this photo is begging its parent for food. So when these chicks are hungry, which is pretty much all the time, if their parent isn't actively feeding them, they'll go over and they might headbutt their parent. They'll get right up in their face. They might bite at their head or neck. I've even seen a picture of a loon chick biting its parent's bill. And that's just to let that parent know, I'm hungry and you need to get me something to eat. At this point, the chicks can dive and catch fish or leeches or aquatic insects and feed themselves, but they really can only provide 30 to 40% of their own diet. So they're still really, really heavily dependent on their parents. And then by the time we get to late August, early September, and these chicks are 12 weeks old, they're pretty much self-sufficient. So they've entirely developed their first set of plumage. They can provide 100% of their own food, although they do frequently still beg their parents for food and try to get a free meal if they can. And at this point, you'll see them taking practice flights to build up their muscles and prepare for their first migration. Around this time, one of the parents might leave the lake to go back to its wintering grounds. And then about a week or two after that first parent leaves, the second parent usually leaves as well. And so these chicks are totally on their own to try to find their way to their ocean wintering grounds, which is a tall order if you've never been there before, right? And so they must be hatched with amazing instincts. We do often see the chicks from a local geographic area grouping up late in the fall. We call that staging before migration. And so they all sort of fly off together. And that could be a strategy that they've developed to just make sure or make it more likely that they all get to where they need to go, sort of a safety in numbers kind of deal. Once these chicks get to the ocean, they'll stay there for usually 3 years. We do have some loons come back before their 3rd year, which is when they develop their adult plumage for the first time and are reproductively mature. It's pretty rare for them to come back when they're subadults because they typically end up getting their butts kicked, basically. They're not quite as strong as the adults. They don't have those territorial hormones going through them. And so if they pick a fight with an adult, typically they're losing that fight. And so we usually only see 5 or 6 subadult loons back on our lakes throughout the whole state in a given year. Okay, so now that we've sort of covered the cycle of loons, I do want to talk a little bit about the threats that they face when they're here on our lake, because unfortunately they do face a lot of threats both to their survival and to their breeding success. And I always like to start off with this photo because it's a really great illustrator of one of the body modifications or adaptations that make loons really great at swimming, but make them really vulnerable when they're on land and nesting. So if the bird we were looking at here was a goose or a duck, its legs would be positioned roughly mid-body, right? And that would enable it to walk upright on land. But in loons, their legs are positioned basically as far back on their body as they could possibly be, which is a real advantage in the water when they're swimming, right? Because every time they kick their feet, they're really maximizing the amount of propulsive force that they get, and they're able to swim really rapidly. They're able to turn really quickly. And they're just really great in the water. They're like a little torpedo. But on land, they can't stand upright. They can't walk upright. And so if you've ever seen a loon getting up, getting on land and walking to its nest, you'll know it's pretty awkward. They kind of flop down on their chests and then just push themselves through the dirt and whatever debris is there until they get to where they want to go. And so it's a really slow way of moving, which makes them vulnerable to predators, right? They can't escape quickly if they're far inland. Um, and it's really energetically intensive. And when you're in the wild, right, you're working hard to get every meal. You don't want to be wasting that energy unnecessarily. And so because of that, because of both of those things, loons tend to nest really close to the water's edge in a nest like this. And on natural lakes, where, if you get a couple of days worth of intense rain and water levels rise, the loons are generally able to keep up with it and they can build up their nest. That's okay. But on lakes that have been dammed or lakes that just tend to experience really dramatic changes in water level, this can be a really big problem for loons. Their nests can get flooded if the water level rises quickly, or they can get stranded if the water level falls. And stranded is just when the water level falls to an extent that it's too difficult for the loon to keep trying to get back and forth from its nest, and they eventually abandon it. And so water level fluctuations have negatively impacted loon reproductive success, both here in New Hampshire and throughout the loon's North American range. Another big problem for loons is human disturbance. So a loon, when it's relaxed on the nest, when it's not feeling threatened, will be in an upright position. It'll be sort of looking around the territory. They're very curious. They like to keep their eyes on things. And so if you see a loon that's in this position, which is what we refer to as hangover, that's a loon that's feeling threatened. And it's trying to, number one, minimize its appearance in hopes that that threat won't see it. And number two, it's getting into this position that's sort of like a dive position, right? So that all it has to do is kick its feet and it'll be back in the water where it's more mobile and it's more able to evade that threat. And so in cases where, a person in a boat comes up on a loon and either doesn't realize it's there or is trying to get a picture of it, or, doesn't realize that this behavior denotes stress, it can cause that loon to flush off of the nest and leave the eggs unattended. And when that happens, the eggs are vulnerable to things like predation and also to temperature changes that can cause the egg to become inviable. And so we really, really want to minimize the amount of human disturbance going on at nest sites so that they can do what they need to do and incubate those eggs continuously and protect them. If you ever do accidentally flush a loon off of a nest, and it does happen, I've accidentally flushed loons before, the best thing to do is get out of that area as quickly as possible, because 9 times out of 10, that loon is gonna get right back on the nest, keep incubating, and things will work out. And so, yeah, if you ever see a loon in this position, back away and continue to back away until it resumes a more relaxed upright position. And if you ever accidentally flush a loon, just get out of there and probably things will turn out okay. And there are some other threats to nesting loons. So shoreline development on lakes where the shoreline has been so intensely developed that the natural nesting sites that are good quality are gone, loons are pushed into more and more marginal quality nesting habitat, and they might nest and nest and nest and fail and fail and fail, either because that nest site is a good site for predation to occur, or it's just vulnerable to other threats. So shoreline development has negatively impacted loon breeding success, again, both here in New Hampshire and throughout the loon's range. Human commensal mammals. So by that I mean those mammals that have always been around and are natural predators, but now are around in higher densities because they have human sources of food like garbage. So things like raccoons are opportunistic predators of loon eggs, and having more of them around just means that there's more of a risk that they might stumble upon an unattended loon egg and predate it before the parents can get back to it. Avian predators, so things like gulls, crows, ravens will predate loon eggs, and eagles may predate loon chicks as well. And so I always feel like it's necessary to really say that at LPC, we are not anti-gull, we are not anti-crow, anti-raven, or anti-eagle. A lot of people expect us to be, but we would much prefer loons to be dealing with these natural threats than dealing with the human-caused threats. The human-caused threats are really the problem for them, not the natural threats like these birds. But we mention it because, in the presence of all of those other human threats, that predation is just sort of another straw on the camel's back. Contaminants, this is a really, really active area of research for us at LPC, and we do have an hour-long presentation dedicated solely to this on our YouTube channel. So if you want more information about it, you can check that out. But the Spark Notes version is that LPC collects every inviable abandoned loon egg that we can get to before the predators do in the state each year. And we're able to test a subset of those eggs for contaminants, including DDT, PCBs, PFAS, and others. And what we found is that the eggs on some lakes have levels of some of those contaminants that have been found to cause reproductive impacts in other species. So we don't yet know what levels of those contaminants are important for loons. That's something that we're actively researching right now, but it's definitely a concern that we're finding them at high levels that have found to cause impacts in other species. And so it's something we're keeping an eye on and looking into because it is a concern. Another threat, and really the biggest threat to loons, is lead fishing tackle. And unfortunately, we did just have our first lead mortality in New Hampshire yesterday. A loon that was rescued on Shaw Pond, no, not Shaw Pond, sorry, White Lake in Tamworth. And, had toxic levels of lead in its system, was just totally debilitated, could barely move, and unfortunately had to be euthanized. And that loon was not alone, because since 1989, lead poisoning resulting from the ingestion of lead fishing tackle has killed 42% of the adult loons that have been documented in New Hampshire. So every year we do collect every dead loon that's reported to us. So if you ever find a dead loon anywhere, please do give us a call, because we want to come and get that loon and necropsy it. And a necropsy is just an autopsy for an animal. And we work with the New Hampshire Veterinary Diagnostic Lab at UNH, as well as with Dr. Mark Pokris at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University to get these loons necropsied and find out what killed them. And so lead poisoning from lead fishing tackle is by far the largest cause of adult loon mortality. It dwarfs any of these others. And I do want to point out that this gray piece of the pie up here is lead poisoning from an unknown object. So those are cases where there's a metal object in their stomach, it tests positive for lead, but by the time we get to it, it's so eroded that we can't definitively say, yes, that's a sinker, or yes, that's a jig. But in all likelihood, it probably was lead tackle. So here I just have some radiographs that show the metal density in the digestive system of these loons. And in both of these cases, and in 157 others, as we saw from the previous graph, those objects, once removed from the gizzard of those loons, were tested, were found to be lead, and were identified as fishing tackle. So why is that a problem for our loons, that we're losing adult loons at those rates? Well, it has a lot to do with the loon's life cycle and their life history. Loons are a classic example of what's known as a K-selected species. And so for those who don't know what that means, there are a couple of things that play into it. The first is that loons are a really long-lived species. So we actually don't know yet how long loons can live. We just recently started banding loons back in the 90s, so within the last 30 years. And what we found is that many of those, that initial cohort of banded loons are still around. The oldest known loon in New Hampshire is a female who was banded as an adult in 1993. So that was 28 years ago. She was an adult, so we know she was at least 3 years old, which would put her at 31 this year, and she was resighted this year already. But because she had chicks when she was banded, and because loons typically are not having chicks until they're about 6 years old on average, we think she's probably more likely 34 or older. And so there are a lot of other loons in New Hampshire that are over the age of 25 and are probably older than that. And so loons are a long-lived species. They have a delayed age of reproduction, and they have a very slow rate of reproduction. So at absolute maximum, a pair of loons will produce 2 chicks per year. But what we found from our long-term data set, that again goes back to 1975, is that the average pair of loons in New Hampshire is actually only fledging 1 chick every other year. So they're not adding a lot of new loons to the population in a given year. And so all of those things combine to mean that the survival of adults is really important to sustaining our population, and ideally to growing our population. And this is another thing that we have a full hour-long talk about on our channel that goes into some population modeling that we've done that shows, exactly how much these lead deaths have affected our loons here in New Hampshire. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please do visit our YouTube channel and you can watch that talk. It was given by Tiffany Grady, our Squam Lakes biologist, and she does a really great job of explaining it. So I'll put in a plug for that. So I hate to, end a talk on the depressing aspect of all those threats. So I like to finish up by talking about what's being done to address those threats. So I'll just give a little bit of a background on LPC. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1975 in response to a really noticeable and dramatic decline in New Hampshire's loon population. At that point in time, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons left in the state, which is very far below their historic levels. And the founding principle behind LPC was that if human actions had caused those declines, and it seemed very, very likely that they had, then human actions could also reverse them. And so I'll go into a little bit of the work that we've been doing since then to help restore New Hampshire's loons. The first component is management. So this photo shows a nest raft, and the nest rafts are designed to help with a lot of the threats that I had mentioned earlier. So they rise and fall with water levels so that loons nesting on a raft aren't going to have their nest flooded and they're not going to be stranded. The rafts provide nesting habitat on lakes that have been so intensely developed that there's no good quality natural habitat left. They mimic an island, which is typically, what loons like to nest on. They prefer small islands. They're anchored out from shore, usually 15 to 20 feet, sometimes more, which doesn't necessarily guarantee that a raccoon or something isn't going to swim out and predate those eggs, but it makes it less likely. And studies have been done that actually do show that predation rates are significantly lower on nest rafts. And then they also have this cover, which is an avian guard that gives them a little bit of camouflage and a little bit of a physical barrier from those avian predators. So last year, LPC staff and volunteers floated 85 nest rafts throughout the state of New Hampshire. This year, we're floating even more than that with the help of some seriously dedicated volunteers, including a couple more that were added to the Monadnock region at lakes where the loons have failed in several of the past years due to a problem that can be solved by a raft. Another management strategy that we use is signs, and these signs are put out at high traffic nest sites or at nest sites where human disturbance has been a problem in the past, and they're just intended to remind people that they really should not be approaching these nests closely, or if a nest is sort of hidden but is in an area that people really like to go to, it's to give people a heads up that there's a nest back there and they shouldn't go back there. On lakes where human disturbance has continued to be a problem, even when there have been signs up, we also will put out these rope lines. And the rope lines are intended to be sort of a reinforcement of the message of the sign by providing a physical barrier and really just communicating that you should not be going any closer to that loon nest if you don't want to negatively impact those loons. We do a lot of public education and outreach. So in a given year, we'll give between 120 and 130 of the presentations that I'm giving to you all now. We also have these Squam Lake Loon Cruises, which is a partnership between us and the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center, where people can go out on the lake with Tiffany, our Squam biologist, and learn about loons while they're looking at loons. And then since 2014, we've been live streaming loon cams where people can get a really intimate view of the entire loon nesting process, from the time that they select their nest site to nest building. We've gotten some really cool and sometimes graphic videos of egg laying. We get to watch over the course of the 28-day period while the loons interact with each other and with other species, including herons, ducks, oftentimes turtles. And then we get a really, really great view of the hatch. And so I use this photo because I just think it's so cool because you can see this first chick has hatched. And if you look at the second egg, there's a white spot over here, and that's where the second chick is starting to break its way out. So this is something that you wouldn't normally get to see, right? And it's so cool to be able to view this process in a way that isn't detrimental to the loons. Because the camera is set up before the loons even start nesting, so they're used to it, they're not bothered by it. So it's a really great and responsible way to watch loons nest. And it's been a really great way to get people interested in loons, to get people interested in loon conservation. Because it's on YouTube, there's a chat feature. And so myself or other LPC staff will often go in there and interact with the watchers and answer questions. And it's been a great tool. Our Loon Cam is live this year. The loons laid their first egg on Monday and they just laid their second egg today. So it's one of those sort of longer stretches between eggs, and it'll be interesting to see how far apart those eggs hatch, or if the second egg does hatch. So if you wanted to watch the Loon Cam, that is on the Loon Preservation Committee YouTube channel. And we expect to hatch sometime around June 20th. We've done a lot of work to try to reduce lead mortalities in loons. So LPC's data and testimony has been used to get a couple of different lead laws passed. The most recent one, which was passed in 2013 and went into effect in 2016, which bans the sale and the use in fresh water of lead sinkers and lead-headed jigs that weigh 1 ounce or less. That's a really protective standard. It's the most protective standard of any state in the country. Sinkers and jigs 1 ounce or less are primarily the ones that have been found to kill loons in the past. But just because that tackle is illegal now, it doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who purchased it prior to the start of that ban. And so our efforts in recent years have really been focused on trying to, number one, make people aware of the fact that this tackle is a problem, because a lot of people don't necessarily know. And number two, try to incentivize them to make the switch to non-lead, loon-safe tackle. So we have a lead tackle buyback program that started in 2018 and is running again this year, where folks can go to a participating retail location, turn in 1 ounce or more of that illegal tackle, and in return they get a $10 voucher for that store that they can use to buy loon-safe tackle or other fishing supplies. If you're interested, if you have lead tackle in your tackle box, or you know someone who might, please do visit loonsafe.org. That's the website that we've set up for the lead tackle buyback. And there you'll find a list of our participating locations so that you can make the switch and get a little bit of money for doing it. We do a lot of loon rescues, and the number seems to be going up as time passes. Last year, we had over 30 loons rescued in the state over the course of the year. Typically, those rescues are happening during the summer, and it's because loons are either tangled in fishing line or they're beaching themselves for some reason. Sometimes that's lead, sometimes it's because they've gotten into a fight with another loon. But we will go out and try to assess the situation, and if a rescue is necessary, we'll try to catch that loon. When we do catch the loon, we try to evaluate it. So we'll take a blood sample to test for lead and other health parameters. We're typically also taking these loons to the vet for a quick radiograph. And then we're consulting with Dr. Pokris, who's the loon expert vet, really, and making sure that he doesn't see anything on that radiograph that's a cause for concern. If we can get these loons untangled and they have a clean bill of health, then we'll release them. And our goal with rescues is really to get these loons back on their lakes as soon as possible. Because loons are a species that do really, really poorly in captivity. That's why you'll never see a loon in a zoo or an aquarium, because they just, they die. They can't handle being in captivity. So we want to be handling them as little as possible for as little time as possible. And so we really try to get them back on the lakes as soon as we can. When we do release rescued loons, in most cases, we'll ban them beforehand. We really only don't ban them if the person with the banding kit is like many hours away. In general, we're trying to ban them because we want to be able to track them over time and see, what the long-term prognosis is for these loons. And what we've found in recent years is that several of the loons that we've rescued are showing back up again on their lakes and are producing chicks. And so not only has that rescue saved the individual adult loon, but it's also, helped to contribute to more chicks being added to the population. We do a lot of research, and for the sake of time, I'm going to just blow right through these. But if anyone has questions about any of them, we can talk about it in the Q&A. So some of the things we're doing: banding and tracking loons. Again, the only reason we know how long loons live, or have a rough idea of how long loons live, is because we have banded loons. And the same thing goes for, why we now know that loons don't necessarily mate for life. We're learning a lot more about behavior and about wintering locations and things like that from the process of banding. Investigating causes of loon mortality through necropsies. Again, that's the way that we learned that lead was such a problem, and we're able to do things to address that problem. So we want to keep on top of any emerging threats to loons. And so collecting those dead loons and necropsying them is a great way to do that. Effects of climate change on loon reproduction. Loons are a northern species. We're very close to the southern edge of their breeding range here. And as things warm up, it could be bad for the loons. So we're keeping an eye on their reproductive rates in warm years and in response to temperature and changing precipitation patterns. Effects of contaminants. I talked about that a little bit. And again, there is a video on our YouTube channel if you're interested in learning more. Cyanotoxins, we work with Jim Haney in his lab at UNH. Every time we ban loons, we take a blood sample and we send some of that to Jim so that he can look at cyanotoxins in that blood as part of his work on cyano blooms in New Hampshire. Effects of lead on loon survival and population growth. That's something that we're continuing to keep an eye on. And causes of nest failure. Similar to the causes of mortality, that just allows us to keep track of what these emerging threats to loons are and potentially develop management solutions. And so I've saved monitoring for last, but it's certainly not least. It's really sort of the bread and butter of what we do. It's how we evaluate if our management is working. It's how we keep an eye on the loon population. So every year, LPC divides the state into 5 geographic regions, each of which get a biologist. And then each of the 3 largest lakes in New Hampshire also get a biologist. And what they're doing is basically counting loons. So they're going out on all of the lakes to see how many loons there are, how many of those loons form a pair, how many pairs nest, because it turns out that only about 2/3 of our paired loons will nest in a given year. A lot of loons take a year off. We don't totally know why, but it's a common occurrence for loons to be present on the territory but not nest. Of the loons that do nest, how many chicks hatch, how many of those chicks survive to mid-August, and then we're also taking really detailed information on nest sites. So did they use an island or a marsh, or were they on the mainland shoreline? Did they have any overhead cover, lateral cover? Did they build up a bowl, or did they just kind of make a scrape in the sand and dump their egg there? And then if the nest failed, we sort of put on our detective hats and try to figure out why. So we look at the condition of the eggshells, we look at where the water level is, we look at the surrounding area and try to see if there's an egg that may have been pulled off of the nest and into the woods and predated there, and things like that. And again, that monitoring allows us to keep an eye on our loon population. And so this graph is a little bit confusing because it tracks, at least this dark blue line tracks the number of paired adults. So you have to divide that by 2 to get the number of loon pairs. But as I mentioned before, back in 1975, there were fewer than 100 loon pairs in the state. And last year, 2020, we had 321 pairs. So our population has more than tripled since 1975. It's been a relatively slow growth and a very hard fought growth, but goes to show that management and people caring and working to help a species can help to bring it back. And so if I've done my job right, I hope that the question you're asking yourself right now is, how can I help loons? And so there are sort of the basic answers and then the more detailed answers. So the number one thing that you can do to help loons is to use only non-lead, loon-safe fishing tackle and encourage anyone that you know that fishes to do the same. Another important thing is to give loons space. So we recommend 150 feet or more, both when they're on the nest and when they're on the water, especially if they have chicks. Again, those loons need to be consistently diving, bringing up food and feeding their chicks. And they can't do that if people are getting too close, because then they sort of shift into protective mode and they're trying to move their chicks away or trying to just sort of defend their chicks. And so, they're not spending time on what they should be doing, which is feeding their chicks. And unfortunately, we have had in the past chicks that are abandoned by their families because a boat, got in between them, separated them, and they weren't able to relocate each other. We've also had chicks die from apparent starvation. And it's possible, though, not totally 100% able to connect it to human disturbance, but sometimes that has happened after we've had reports of severe human disturbance. So really the best way to watch loons is through a pair of binoculars, and the best way to photograph them is not on your phone, unfortunately, but through a telephoto lens. And then if you're interested in volunteering specifically with the work that we're doing, one of the best things that you can do is report your loon observations. So the biologist for the Monadnock region this year is Mary Caffrey. She just started her surveys yesterday. And she has something like 90 lakes that she needs to cover. And so that means that throughout the course of the summer, she can really only visit each lake 3 to 5 times. And so the majority of what's going on with the loons is going on between the times that she's there. And so she's probably able to pick up on the big stuff, like whether or not they nested, whether or not they had chicks, and whether or not those chicks survived. But a lot of the detail is lost if we don't have volunteers on the lake reporting to us. So we do have a big volunteer base. We're always looking for more. And if you spend time on lakes, or if you live on lakes and you want to help us keep an eye on the loons, if you're in the Monadnock region, you can email Mary directly at monadnock@loon.org. If you're not in the Monadnock region, but you're still in New Hampshire, you can email me at volunteers@loon.org, and I can put you in touch with the correct biologist. Other things that are really helpful include helping us to float, retrieve, or store rafts and signs. So again, Mary is super busy, and a lot of the time her nests start up pretty much one on top of the other. And so if we get a request for signs, and we usually do, we have to sort of respond to those requests in the order that we get them. And if we have a lot of loons going on the nest at the same time, that often means that the lakes that are reported a little later have to wait a day or two. And so if we have a volunteer on the lake who we can drop off the signs with and they can put them out, those loons can get protected a little bit earlier. If you're interested in volunteering, but none of those sound like something that you're able to do, you can also send me an email at volunteers@loon.org, and we can try to figure out something that will work. So that's all I have prepared, but I'm glad and excited to answer any questions.
There are a lot of questions, Caroline.
Okay.
I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we will try. First question was about their red eye. Why do they have a red eye? And also we noticed that when they're young, their eye isn't red, but it changes as they get older. So what's the biology behind their red eye?
Yeah, so there's sort of this old myth that the red eye is to help them see better underwater. There's no evidence that that's actually true. As far as we can tell, it's just a part of their breeding plumage used to attract a mate. It's really only that bright red during the breeding season. When they're adults, they don't have it as chicks. And so it just seems to be, as far as we're aware, so far. And we could always learn something different tomorrow and totally change our perspective on it. But as far as we're aware now, it's just a part of that breeding plumage to attract other loons.
Oh, so cool. I had heard that old wives' tale about the being able to see underwater better with the red eye. So it's good that you busted that myth up. It's good. All right, here's another question. This is from Gail. She's wondering, when chicks are staging before they fly for their winter grounds, how do they find each other? So they're coming from different lakes. How do they find each other?
That's a good question. And I don't know that we really know exactly how they're doing it. It could be through vocalizations. It could be that they all just kind of look for the biggest lake they can find and land there, because it does tend to happen on the larger lakes. But yeah, a really good question. And unfortunately, one that we don't totally know the answer to, although there are some hypotheses like that.
It's good. Sounds like there's still room for research in the loon field.
Absolutely.
All right, that's good. All right, and Jean is wondering if loons nest on Bow Lake. And she's also wondering, or he is wondering about, do they prefer a specific direction for their nest to face? North shore, south shore? Is it oriented in a specific direction typically?
Yeah, so there are, Bow Lake is one of those lakes that's big enough to have multiple pairs of loons. So there are a bunch of different loon pairs there that nest. As far as the nesting orientation goes, typically they're trying to be on whatever, if they're on an island, it's whatever side of that island is not facing the wind. They don't want to have big waves caused by wind action coming and washing over their nest. So typically they're not on the windward side of the island, they're on the leeward side of the island. And similarly, if they're in a cove, again, they're going to try to position their nest in a way where they're not getting a lot of wind and wave action.
Yeah, so it's more the wind than the sun.
Right. Yeah, we have plenty of loons that nest just right out in the middle of, the open, and they pant like 100% of the time they're on their nest because they're heat stressed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay. This is a question that both Gail and I were wondering. We noticed on the pie chart of mortality, there was a sliver marked loon trauma. What is
Yes.
loon trauma?
So I mentioned territorial interactions several times in this presentation. Um, Loons are really aggressive and they will fight each other, and sometimes they'll fight each other to the death.
Wow.
So Dr. Pokris has done thousands and thousands of necropsies. And what he's found is that in a lot of loons, almost 50% of the loons that he necropsies have holes in their sternums that perfectly fit the size and shape of a loon bill. So they're routinely getting into fights that, progress to that stage where they're spearing each other and sometimes breaking through bone. Um, and we find those punctures in loons that didn't die from loon trauma. So sometimes, the loon, and often the loons get lucky and that other loon's bill doesn't hit an internal organ, and they're able to heal up and continue living after that. But some loons do get unlucky and, that other loon pierces an organ and they die from that trauma.
Okay, so Gail just clarified her question for me. I was interested in what loon trauma was. She's wondering what trauma is. It just says trauma 27.
Yeah. So unspecified trauma is loons that have died from some sort of force. There's a lot of internal bleeding or there's internal bruising, but we can't clearly prove that it was loon trauma because there's no puncture either in the sternum or in the skin. And it's not totally clear if it was from a boat collision. So it's sort of unspecified trauma that we don't totally know where it came from.
So sticking with loon mortality and
Sure.
lead, or if a loon has lead poisoning or lead toxicity in it, are there any solutions? Do they ever do like any chelation therapy with them? Or is there anything that can be done if you find a loon that has lead in it?
Yeah, so the problem with lead is that in most cases, at least here in New Hampshire, the loons don't start showing the signs of it where we realize they need a rescue until it's too late. At that point, their lead level is, our machine actually only reads up to 60 micrograms per deciliter, which is extremely toxic to loons. Generally, at least from what we've discovered, if it's over 30, that's usually going to be a fatal case of lead poisoning. And after we hit 60, our machine just says high. And so most of the loons that are coming into us are reading high. And so it could be that they're at 61. It could be that they're at 700. We don't know because our machine doesn't read higher than that. Sometimes we will try, especially if they're not high, but they're at 30 or they're at 25. But in most of those cases, it still hasn't worked out. And in fact, there's only been one successfully lead rehab loon in New Hampshire. And the reason that one was successful is because that loon's lead poisoning caused it to become iced in. And so we went out and rescued it before it started showing those other signs of lead poisoning, like lethargy. And its lead level was only 14 micrograms per deciliter. And so it was able to be chelated and treated, and has returned and produced chicks in many of the years since it was rescued. But that's our only success story here in New Hampshire. So in general, even if treatment is pursued, which it has been in several cases, the loons just don't make it.
Wow, that's really sad, and more reason to get rid of your lead tackle and help other people get rid of it too. Okay, here's a question from Mira. She says, I get the red-throated loon and the common loon confused, but I've only seen them in the winter. Are they the same species? Are they different? And can you see them in the spring and summer? Where would you have to go?
Yeah, so there are 5 loon species. The common loon is the only one that breeds in New Hampshire, but we do have red throats that winter off of our coasts. So there's the red-throated loon, the common loon, the yellow-billed loon, the Arctic loon, and the Pacific loon. And again, the common loon is the only one that breeds here in New Hampshire. Red throats tend to breed further north, up in Canada, Alaska, that area. And they tend to be a lot smaller than our common loons. They're just a smaller species. And when they're in their winter plumage, so our common loons have, let's see if I can go back far enough. They don't really have any distinct patterns here, whereas the red-throated loon will have sort of a scalloped edge that's not quite a scallop. It's kind of like a pointy V shape in white at the tips of their feathers, which can help you to tell them apart.
Cool. Great. That was really helpful. All right. Here's a question that Cindy wants to know. She would like you to talk about how loons fly kind of off the water and kind of in the winter, like when it starts to get cold and the ice is coming in, can that be a problem for them?
Hmm. Yeah, so what I didn't mention in my talk is that loons are really heavy-bodied birds. To help them swim and dive better, because they spend most of their life in the water, they actually have dense bones, which is unlike a lot of other birds. So they're really heavy and they have relatively narrow wings, which means that they have really high rates of wing loading. There's a lot of weight that each square inch of their wing has to support. And because of that, they often need a long runway to take off. They just have to work a lot harder to gain altitude. So when they're taking off, you'll see them running across the surface of the water while flapping their wings. It can take up to a quarter of a mile for them to achieve flight, although if they have a strong headwind, they can do it up in, as little as 30 meters, or even shorter distances if they're in a pinch. But once they take off, if there's trees around the lake, they often have to circle it a couple times to gain enough altitude to clear those trees. So they do need a decently long runway. And if they don't leave their lakes in time and the ice starts coming in and surprises them, then they can get iced in. And we do have to do ice rescues. In the past years, we've done at least one in every year. This past year, we did. We got calls about 6 within one weekend, and we did 5 and Fish and Game did the other one. They were all over the state from Pittsburgh down to the Massachusetts border. So yeah, it can be a problem for them in the winter, especially if they don't leave their lakes. Most loons do leave their lakes in time and it's not a problem. But if that loon is debilitated, so like the loon I mentioned earlier that had lead poisoning that prevented it from getting off of its lake in time, or this year we had a loon that had a case of aspergillosis, which is a respiratory disease caused by a fungal infection, then those might be things that cause them to stay on too long and get iced in.
Wow, so fascinating. I have one last question. I know there was a few more, but we're going to end. We're already ending a little late. If you didn't get your question answered, Caroline, people can just email you directly.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm sorry I went long with my talk.
No, it was so fascinating. But I think this is a really good one to end on. It's from Catherine. She said she remembers you mentioning 75 platforms were put out last year. And how many did you float this year with the volunteers?
Yeah, so this year, and we're not done floating them for this year, but the goal was to float an additional 20 because there were just that many territories where the nests have failed and needed them. I think so far we've floated 13 to 15 of those, so still more to do. But in total, we should be somewhere around or just over 100 nest rafts this year.
That's so remarkable. And the work that LPC does is just amazing for this beautiful and iconic northern bird. And we're all so excited about your presentation. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. And I thank everybody for showing up and hope that when you're out on the ponds and lakes this year, you can keep your distance from these beautiful birds and remind other people to as well, and switch out that fishing tackle and volunteer for LPC because they are amazing. So thank you, Caroline. I give you a standing ovation from my Zoom right here. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, and thanks to the Harris Center. You guys are amazing as well, and we always appreciate your help with the loon rafts and everything that you do for us.
Oh, thank you. Well, and we appreciate everybody who showed up tonight to find out more about these beautiful birds. So happy loon watching to everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.